Without any further ado, though, please a round of applause for Andy.
We have a lot of stuff to cover today. I'm going to be moving very quickly through a series of legacy APIs, and then we're going to try to get to Eric as fast as possible. He's going to be talking about 2 new APIs that are coming in Core 4. So move along. First and foremost, why? Why do you need to know the APIs? I would say requirements. Most people usually need to meet something at their job, whether it be integration with ticketing systems, development of third-party dashboards, something flashy for management, integration with internal applications, etc. There's a lot of good reasons to know this, if anything, just so that you have a better understanding for troubleshooting and diagnosis of Nagios. So we'll be covering Nagios core APIs. We'll talk just briefly about objects cache, status dat, the core CGIs. We'll move then very quickly into the backend XML API and XI, and then we'll talk a little bit about the PHP content gets. At that point, I'll probably also touch on the ticketing username and ID system that isn't an XI, so that you can have passwordless rapid response URLs, highly useful for integration into other dashboards. And then we'll move on to the Core 4 query handler with Eric Stanley and the Json Cgi with Eric Stanley. So, legacy APIs. You guys have probably all seen these files at one point or another if you've ever cracked open the CLI and core. We'll start first with objects cache. This is a static file. It's written out when Nagios restarts. It includes all the object information. There are field separators. They're new lines. Record separators or object separators would be 2 new lines. This is important if you're going to parse it. First, we'll take a look at these would be the order and the objects that would appear in objects cache. Each one of these is more or less correlative to the objects, the object configuration files you'd actually write. Status dat, again, it is written out on Nagios restart. Now, these things are not persistent. Neither of these files will persist if you stop Nagios. This contains the status information. This is usually the information you're most concerned about. Last check, next check times, etc. Again, field separators, new line, record separators, 2 new lines. And a quick output of the types of objects you'll find in this file, and the order that you'll see them in. Just a quick note, that grep will only work if you don't have an open curly brace anywhere else in your in like your check command. Moving on, this is a small excerpt of status dat. This is what the objects will look like, whether they're in objects cache or status dat. You can see that we have like a key, a value, and most of the files will be organized, or most of the objects will be organized like this in these flat files. Just a quick note on parsing. This is just one simple awk. There are many ways to do this: set awk, grep, gawk, etc. Field separator, new line, record separator, 2 new lines. This would allow you then to choose a record, which would be possibly contact status. It does append the, over here in record, it does append the open curly brace. And then the search would be anything that you're going to limit in there, keys, values, etc. Again, this is just one way to do it. There's a lot of ways to do it. These slides will be available online. Again, we're going to be moving very quickly through a lot of this. So just kind of a quick wrap up on the core files. What's really nice about these is you can use pretty much any programming language you want. It's very simple, fairly effective, really nice for quick one-offs and queries. If you're at the CLI and you just need to know a very specific piece of information, a quick awk or a quick sed will get you there. Good for people comfortable with the CLI. Good old Unix experience. Now, you can impress your coworkers, annoy your friends, bore your friends, annoy your management, and please teach your interns. If they learn how to use Bash, everybody will be happier in your company. Some issues with these files are issues of note. They are flat. They can get very large in large installations. They're not something that you want to routinely parse. They're disk-based. They can be slow. If you don't have CLI parsing skills, cut your chops before you start to rely on them for actual requirements. There's no front end of these. Your front end is Bash or the shell of your choice. There's no externally accessible API. And doing multiple object comparisons and correlations can be a rather tricky endeavor with flat files. If you're a CLI guru or parsing guru, you can get most of the way there, but it can still be rather frustrating. That's why there's better APIs that have been built. This is a quick list of the core CGIs that are currently available in core, other than what Eric Stanley is going to be talking about. Couple of notes here. There are ways for you to investigate these CGIs. We're not going to have time to go through even a fairly comprehensive study of even one of the CGIs. They are too dense. There's too many options, too many selectors. Right-click on a link that you're interested in learning what the actual full URL is. These are gets. So you right-click, open a new tab. You can investigate the URL from that point to understand what types of selectors or key values you can actually use to limit the HTML you're going to receive from the CGI. General format here, pretty straightforward. I assume a lot of you have used get queries through a URL. If you are not familiar with it, we'll run through it very, very quickly. Here is the IP of your server, the rest of the path, CGI, and that'll like status.cgi, etc. From that previous screen. Those will fill in the CGI portion. Your selector or your key, and then your value. These can be things like hosts or services, etc. Every CGI is going to have a different range of selectors. There is some documentation. It's mostly in the source. Beyond that, right-click the URL or right-click the link, open it up, investigate the URL, change what you see fit, and then resubmit it and see if you get any information through the get. Just kind of a couple of quick examples. Using status CGI, we declare host equals gen2. That'll display the status HTML for that host. They're usually tables. They're HTML. There are some issues like there's no good HTML IDs, like ID tags on any of these, so they can be rather hard to parse. Another example with an additional selector on there, host equals gen2 and service equals load. That would show the load on the host gen2. So like an idea of some selectors, we have host groups. You can also query all there. Instead of actually defining a host group, you can define a host, and again, you can query all, and there are a lot of style options for the status CGI. Additionally, there's more selectors. I hope you go out and investigate them if you're interested. Status CGI, there's an important thing to note. These are bitwise or bitmask operations. When it comes to trying to pull status information, it can be a little bit confusing. Here's a short list of the ones you're going to most likely use. The way that you would actually create the query for the CGI would be to add these. If you only want pending and unknown, you're going to end up using 9 for the service state types. And this works the same way for host state types, or host status types, sorry. And again, you'd add the numbers together, and that number would be what you end up passing in the get. These things are very useful if you're going to be integrating custom front-end dashboards. This is just a really, really quick example of how you would do that. This example can only be used when you're working off the Nagios server and you're building a web page for the Nagios server. There are cross-domain restrictions for doing certain AJAX calls. So this example here can only be used on the local Nagios server. This example can be used for cross-site because you're loading into iframe. I'm sure a lot of people here that are building front ends understand some of the complexities of a cross-origin. But if you don't, you can play with this. It'll give you a nice little small iframe that will scroll through the status. You can then build your view from there. Some pros here. It's universal. Every installation of Nagios, Nagios derivatives, Nagios Xi have these CGIs. They are around, so you can pretty much guarantee that if you walk into a situation where there is a Nagios server, these are accessible, and in fact, most front ends at some point or another are scraping the HTML. It's very easy to build new dashboards with this information. Just don't try to actually really drill down and scrape it, because there are some issues with that. There's no HTML ID tags, so you're going to have some rather interesting problems when it comes to actually parsing the HTML and just pulling the information you want. It's mostly tables, it strictly outputs HTML, and you're usually grabbing the summaries with other tables. So you're not getting just one flat table. We're going to move into Nagios Xi. There are some things that have been extended in Xi beyond what's available in core. There's an XML Back-End system. Outputs XML. It has some logical operators. It obviously offers up multiple selector values. And then there's some base queries that we'll call commands. After that, we'll move into the direct URLs. It's kind of like the ability to right-click a link, open it up in a new page, investigate the selectors. And we'll touch on status PHP and XI for just a very quick moment, and then we'll talk about the ticket IDs and password list gets. The Nagios XML Backend outputs XML, as I've mentioned a couple of times. Again, it's accessible through gets. It does integrate with the ticket ID system that we'll cover later on, which will allow the object views to be restricted based on the user and password that you pass with that, or user and ticket ID that you pass with the get. Multiple selectors, logical operators. It allows for very easy importing into spreadsheets. Management loves that. When they ask for a specific number of contacts over a specific number of hosts, you can use the backend to very quickly get a nice clean list or a nice clean XML object that can be imported into the application of your choice. It also offers a read-only interface to Nagios, which would be your status information. Assume it's like status.dat, the Nagios database. And then the Nagios QL database would be your static object information. Assume it's like objects.cache or the core configs. We touched on this with core, so I'm just going to move over it very quickly. You can construct a URL GET request again with XI and get the XML output. Here's a couple of examples. I did mention the command. The command will, there's a nice list. Here's two of them: get host status, get service status. That's basically gives you the information that you're going to start limiting with further key values. And again, the format's really close to what you'd see in some of the CGIs. Host name equals localhost. Current state equals not equal to 0. This would give you all of the current services that are currently not in OK status. Some other ones. This is not like middle string match to ping. We'll get to the logical operators in a minute. There is an option to pass combine host that will return an XML object that not only gives you a service listing, but also gives you a host listing as well, and attach the hosts to those services. Here are all the backend commands that currently exist in Xi for starting your URL GET query. There's actually a couple more. They're rather buried, but it does offer a pretty robust way to get the XML objects and to limit it down to exactly what you want. Every GET must start with a command. We covered that. Properly formatted GETs will return XML data, and it is properly formatted XML data. It should import into anything. It should very easily integrate into other front ends that accept XML on the back end. If you're unsure of the selector values, again, like the CGIs, investigate. You're not going to break anything by right-clicking the link, opening up, and playing with the selectors. At worst, you're going to get like a 404 or an empty XML object. We do offer, with the XML backend, the capability for logical operators, string matches, and the like. They are attached to the value in the key value pair, separated by a colon. Example here that we covered earlier is the not equal to 0. It'll show all the hosts that are currently not in OK state. Get service status name ping, execution time greater than 2. This will return all ping services that took longer than 2 seconds to complete. It does accept floats, so you can actually pass it a rather small number. Logical operators and string matches. This is, as far as I can tell from going through the sources, a comprehensive list of the things you can actually use to pass. Some are based on strings, some expect numbers. It should be pretty straightforward which ones there are. Just like a note or two here on like, these will only match the beginning of the string. These will only match the end of the string. If the string continues on, you don't want to use those. You're going to want to use the middle string matches, which are also basically the equals, which is the default. Equals is not case sensitive, and again, will match the middle of the strings. You can kind of consider these two as more or less equivalent to equals. In and not in should be pretty straightforward as well. The XML backend, just a few things here. Remember to URL encode your key value, your selector pairs. If you have a space in a host name, you better make sure that you're accounting for that when you're passing it through the URL. You must always declare a command first. If you don't declare a command first, you're going to end up with an empty XML object. You can pass brevity3 as an additional key value, and that will pass you a very limited subset of the information of the objects that you're querying. Brevity1 will give you the full-blown object for each one. Brevity3 will make it much smaller. It's actually important to note that if you're only looking for host names, current state, last check, next check, you can probably almost always use Brevity3 unless you're really trying to drill into some of the more particular status information or object information. The multiple logical operators on multiple values can really help you limit things down to the information that you're looking for. And again, some of these queries do touch the database. Other ones still just scrape the old files. Some actually still scrape the CGIs. If you're going to set up an AJAX loop to pull this information to integrate into another front end, don't do it on 1 second intervals. You'll have a bad time. A couple of notes here on why you want to use the XML backend. It's reasonably quick for outputting XML. As quick as the CGI, sometimes quicker depending on what it's actually querying from. It's easily importable into other applications that can deal with XML. We talked about that. Integrates very easily into other web frameworks. XML and JSON are probably the big ones that are used to pass data between apps or web applications these days. Very, very easy to integrate into other solutions. Use the brevity selector when possible. Please, please, please do so. Your Nagios server will be happier for it. And it works really nicely with AJAX loops, especially if you use Brevity3. You can actually query a little bit quicker on the loops and get near real time within 20, 30 seconds, near real time information output from it. Some issues with this. It does work. Some queries do require SQL lookups. There's not a good documentation on which ones do, so go ahead and play with it. If you want, you create a really, really large query. Watch your SQL load, see if it goes up, or go investigate the PHP. Very, very few bits of PHP and XI are actually encrypted, so you should be able to investigate these as you see fit. One of the issues would be if you're going to be integrating it into a front end that only uses JSON or object notation for JavaScript. You're gonna have to parse it, which does put an extra step in the process. jQuery's got a great little parser. It's pretty dang quick. As XML, it's 33% larger than it needs to be. For most of the queries, I think you were talking about this, and it ends up only being maybe 20% larger than JSON because of some of the markup. And the times are all exported in date time. I apologize. Instead of Unix time, we'll get to that in the Json Cgi because there are some new options to actually get Unix time, which makes it easier to do certain client-side operations without having to parse it to Unix time and back. Moving on to the direct URLs, I'm really going to just run over this very quickly because this is what we've been talking about with the core CGIs and with a portion of the XML backend. It's very, very close to the same thing. You can right-click on just about any link in XI, send it to a new page, investigate the URL, change the selectors as you see fit. Some of them will output like a status table with like a summary table. Other ones just output a status table, et cetera, et cetera. Here is the standard URL you'd use to access most of the backend page or most of the URL pages in XI. Oh, actually, one more thing. If the page you're trying to access has forms, walk through the forms, right? You'll first open it up in a new page or a new tab, walk through the forms, and when you're done walking through the forms, the final output will include the URL necessary to never have to use those forms for that query again. Status PHP, quick overview here. There are usually a number of views that can be accessed. Here's a list of the views that you would find. These will affect what type of HTML gets output from the query. Process information about the Nagios process and some of the extra XI backend stuff. Performance information about XI and whatnot. Services, hosts, comments, host groups, service groups, those are all, everything here is pretty straightforward. Tactical overview, outages, maps, search. Here's a very, we're going to run through these slides in this section, really quick, status PHP show process. This will output these two dashlets that you can then embed into your web page if you're kind of concerned about having a dashboard that has Nagios or the process information. Another quick example using a handful of selectors. Again, they always must declare a view first, and then host group with a style. The overview style does include the summaries and just gives you a very quick overview. Again, if we chose a couple of different styles here, you'd get some different outputs. One last note on status PHP. Here you can also use it to pull the different frames from the object details screens, and you can even have it query right to a div, which will open up the necessary tab immediately. So it's kind of nice if you want to have a couple of links that take you right to your perf data and a custom front end that's been integrated into Xi. Ticket IDs. If you don't know about this and you use Xi, you absolutely should. This is what's used for the rapid response URLs if you decided to use it and not turn it off because you're afraid of the security concerns with it. They can be appended to a GET request as another selector or key value. Very useful for integrating into other web front ends or sculpting custom emails that need to go out with a rapid response URL, or at least a URL that you want someone to click to end up to see the view that you want them to. It's highly suggested. I'll probably say this again in about 5 minutes. Make a read-only user. It is a slight security concern, and it's a huge security concern if you don't make a read-only user. Make a read-only user and harvest the username and ticket for that user. If you're wondering how to get the username and ticket information, you will descend into the admin panel, open up the Backend URL API component, and you will see a series of forms. At the end of the form, you will find username equals and % ticket equals. And here's a short example of what it may look like. Now you can take this whole statement here and append it to pretty much any get in Xi in order to be able to end up at that page without a password. I'm going to turn the floor over to Eric Stanley, and he's going to talk about some new features coming in Core 4 and beyond.
I'll give you guys I was going to say I'd give you guys, am I on here? Okay, I'd give you guys a second here for your input buffers to empty. That was a lot of information in a short time. So anyway, what I wanted to talk about today were two new things in Core 4. The first one being the query handler. For those of you that weren't in the presentation this morning, what is the query handler? It's essentially an interface to the running Nagios core daemon. Allows you to get information from core directly about things that are going on. A couple of things you need to know about them. They run in the main Nagios thread. So if you're writing a query handler, you want to make sure it's really fast. Otherwise, you'll block everything else that happens in there. Currently, they also have to be compiled into Nagios core. They're not loadable like modules. And the communication for these things uses a Unix domain socket. There are 5 query handlers built into core. Again, I mentioned this morning, but for anybody that wasn't in the presentation, the core query handler provides management and information about core. Surprise, surprise. The wproc query handler provides a way for worker processes to register themselves with core, and it also gives you a way to get information about the worker processes. In fact, we'll see that a little bit later in a demo that I'm going to show you. The nerd query handler is a subscription service. Actually, NERD is an acronym, stands for Nagios Event Radio Dispatcher. I think Andreas Eriksson came up with that one, and he actually decided on the acronym before he figured out what it would mean, because he wanted to have a cool acronym like that. But that gives you the ability to, for example, if you subscribe to the host checks channel, it'll just spit out the results of every host check, so you can watch that as it goes by. The help query handler provides help for the query handler interface. One of the commands there is the list command. So if you type help list, it will show you all of the registered query handlers, so you can know which ones you can choose from. And then finally, the echo command simply echoes back what you send to it, can be used for testing. The query handler uses a pretty simple interface, and actually that's incorrect. I need to fix that. It's query handler name and then the command and then any parameters. So I'll fix that before we publish these slides. And then followed by a null character to terminate a command. There's a nifty little tool written by Dan Wittenberg. It's Ruby-based that will connect to the query handler socket and allow you sort of a command line interface to that. And you'll get to see that here in the demo, which I'm going to do right now. And one of the cardinal rules for presenters is never do a demo live. So I recorded this. And I'm going to hopefully be able to talk through it at the same pace that it actually plays back. We'll see how that goes. So what I'm going to show you in this demo is a sample query handler that I wrote that would get you some basic information about what's going on in core. You can see it's fairly short, 144 lines of C code. This function at the bottom of the file simply initializes or registers the query handler's handler function, and it's called from the Nagios main function, which for you non-C programmers is the entry point to any C program. So that's the registration process. Then this function at the top, its sole purpose in life is to take a string and attach it to the end of the output buffer. Then the heart of the query handler is this function right here, which is the handler itself. And it handles three cases. The first case here is where you either pass it no command or you pass it the help command. It simply outputs the valid commands. And in this case, we have two valid commands, host list and service list. And then a little bit further down, you see the portion of the code that handles the host list. All it does is iterate over the list of hosts, adding each host name to the output. I've got some extra information in here for keeping track of how long the process takes, mostly because I was curious how long it takes. And then this is the case for the service list command. This is what handles the service list command, essentially the same as the host list command, except that we're outputting both host names and service descriptions. All right, now I'm going to start up the Nagios core, and I'm starting it in the foreground so you can see what happens. After core starts up, prints version number, you can see here's the nerd query handler registering itself. It's just outputting, say I'm done. Then here's the wproc query handler registering itself. And then on my system, there are 4 worker processes that start up. Those are registering themselves through the wproc query handler. And then this object is the sample query handler that I'm demonstrating here today. The next thing I'm going to do after this, finish is waiting, is I'm going to go ahead and start up that query handler sort of command line interface that Dan wrote, and I'm passing it a parameter to tell it where the query handler socket is. And so you see when it starts up, one of the first things it does on its own, without any prompting from me, is it does a help list. So it lists the registered query handlers. And in this case, we have the 5 default ones and then my sample object query handler. So let's run a couple of these. If you remember, the echo query handler simply echoes back what you send to it. So let's send something to the echo query handler. Oh, thank you. I'm glad somebody likes the presentation. Next, let's run the wproc handler. And it will, if we run it with no commands, it will simply tell us what commands are available. Now, we don't really want to register a query handler at this point, so let's just run and get some the stats of the worker processes. Remember, we started 4 earlier. This is showing us we have 4, showing us the process IDs, how many jobs are currently running. and how many jobs have run since the each worker started. Let's try my object query handler here. And I did this on purpose. I mistyped the command so that you could see that it actually returns a bad request when you do that. No, I'm kidding. I didn't do that on purpose. Let's really do a service list. Okay, so you can see it's just returning a list of all the services, and my curiosity is satisfied. It finished that in 10 microseconds, which is kind of nice. The last thing I want to do is briefly subscribe to one of the nerd channels. I think we're going to subscribe to the service checks channel. And since this is my development system and not much is going on, I'm going to go over and quickly force a service check to happen so you guys can see something interesting. There we go. So you can see it ran a service check on the host Pepin, the service HTTP, and it transitioned from state 0 to state 0, meaning it went from OK to OK. And then, in fact, after we did that, you can see it performed a couple more service checks and output those in that nerd channel. That's the demonstration that I had for, where's my mouse? For the query handler. And we'll take some questions afterwards, so if you guys have questions on that stuff, let me find my place in the slide presentation, and we can get back to the next topic, which is something new. We've been kind of working on it internally for a couple of months. It's the Json Cgis. The goal in building these Json Cgis, well, we actually had several goals in mind. One of them was to be able to provide all of the information that's available in the current Cgis in JSON format. Reason being, well, actually there were a couple of reasons. I was working on some issues where that would have been really handy for me. So, okay, well, let's just do it. But it also enables us to place the presentation responsibility on the client. So if you don't like the way the data is displayed, okay, go ahead. Pull the data down yourself, display it the way you like it in your interface. I think Janice said something would be useful for you. We also wanted to minimize the network traffic and minimize the server load. And some of these are somewhat in conflict, so there is an extent to which we are trying to balance those. And then also we wanted to perform operations on the server side that are significantly more easily done there. So there are some things that we don't currently support in the Json Cgis because they're better done on the client side. There are currently 3 Json Cgis. Object.json, which provides static information, and essentially, if you remember Andy showing you the object cache file, this is the sort of information that would be in the object cache file. Status.json is providing more dynamic information, again similar to what's in the status.dat file. And then the archive.json provides historical information, oh, there's another typo, by parsing the archive logs. The Json Cgis have several things in common. The first is that they all use HTTP GET requests for passing parameters to them. They currently use the same authentication as other Cgis, which is usually the web server doing the authentication, and then once that authentication is done, all you have to do is pass the username through. Each of the Cgis has a number of parameters. There is always a required parameter called the query parameter, which specifies, well, which query do you want to run for this particular JSON, for this particular CGI, and we'll get to a list of what some of those queries are. There are a handful of format options. This is mostly for people that are using them interactively. You want to pull some information, make sure it looks right. So you can specify, well, I want to format dates, or I want to instead of showing raw numbers for enumerated values, show me the string representation of that number. There's one for putting some white space in the output if you're doing it on the command line, because otherwise it can be pretty hard to read if it's just one long string. And then all of the other options that act as selectors. So for example, if you're doing a list of hosts, you can say, well, I want a list of all the hosts, but limit it to the ones that are in this host group. So you can use host group as a selector. Selectors are always ANDed together. So if you do more than one selector, you'll be limiting your list even further. And one of the things that I did was I put help in all of the Json Cgis. So if you run with the query equals help, it will actually display all of the options that are available, all of the valid values for enumeration types, and we'll see that a little bit later. Thought that was really important to be self-documenting. Didn't want to have people dig through the code or depend on other documentation that might get out of date fairly quickly. So, all right, I mentioned that there were 3 Json Cgis. The first one is, that I want to talk about is the object Json Cgi. It provides configuration information for the Nagios objects, current state for some runtime, configurable attributes. For example, you can turn whether or not active checks are enabled. You can enable and disable the runtime, so it would reflect the current state of that, not necessarily what you had configured in the config file. All of the object types have count and list queries, so you can get a count of the number of hosts, you can get a list of all the service groups, count of all the commands, a list of all the time periods, etc. Any objects that are named also have individual object queries. So I can say, I want information on this particular host. You pass it the host name, it returns that information. Obviously, because host and service dependencies and escalations are not named, there's no way to uniquely identify them. You can't do a query of an individual, for example, host escalation. All right, the status Json Cgi provides runtime information for Nagios objects. For hosts and services, it's similar to what was in the object JSON. CGI, it's a count, a list, and individual object queries. For comments and downtimes, because they're not named, it's just the count and list queries. And there are 2 kind of one-off queries in the status JSON. The program status. Program status is all the stuff that's it's in the program status section of the status.dat. And then performance data is all of the information that's on the performance info page in the current CGIs. It happens to be extinfo.cgi type 4. Okay. The third and final JSON CGI that's available today is the archive JSON, which provides historical information. Alerts, you can get both a count and alert lists. Notifications, again, you can get counts and lists. State changes, there's not really a state change CGI currently, but state change information is used to build graphical displays on the trends CGI and the availability CGI. And then the last CGI that in the archive family is the availability CGI, which is pretty self-explanatory. So when you run one of these queries, what do you get back? Well, you get 3 things at the top level of your output. You get a format version, which indicates the version of the data that follows it. So if you're writing something to read this data, you can look at that format version and go, did it change? Oh, nope, okay, I can depend on whatever code I had to parse that data to still work. It's an integer value, and right now it's 0, meaning that this is still in development and there's no guarantee of stability, although it hasn't changed in quite some time. The second thing that you get in the output is a results object. It's kind of the general results of the query. It gives you the query time, which is the time that the server began processing the query. And this is useful, for example, if you're doing updates, to be able to say, well, I got information, you know, at 2:15:46 last time. All right, give me all the updates since 2:15:46. And you can use it for that. Program start is the time that Nagios Core was last started. That can be useful, for example, if you cache information on the client side. You can check to see, well, did it restart since the last time I did a query? If it did, maybe I need to throw away all that cached information and get new information. The type code is the type of the result. 0 for success, and a couple of other numbers for failures of some sort. The type text is a generic representation of the type code, mostly for human readability purposes. And then the message would be details about the result. So for example, you sent it a query and you didn't specify the host name where the host name is required. It would say you forgot the host name. The third object that comes in the output is the data itself, is the data that resulted from the query. And that's actually, I think it's universally true that that contains two objects itself. No, excuse me. It always contains the selectors object and at least one object that with query data. So what the selectors are, what the selector object contains is the selectors that it actually used to fulfill your query. So for example, you send it a host and you say, I want the hosts in this host group and also services in this service group. Well, the service group doesn't make sense for a host group query or a host query. So the selectors will only return the host group selector because it didn't use the service group selector. So it allows you to see what was actually used to build the query results. And then the second and subsequent objects within the data object are the results of the data. So for example, if you do a time period count, it would just return the number of time periods that met the selector criteria. Or if you did a single host, it would return the information for that requested host. All right. After a while, when I started developing this, I got kind of tired of typing all these GET requests into the command line. And so I built a little tool that I'm calling the Json Query Generator. It's a JavaScript tool, single page. What it does is it parses when you first start it up, you pick a query, and we'll see this in the demo. Sends a help command, parses the help command, and builds a form based on the information that is returned in the help command. And then when you hit the send query button, it actually executes the query and displays the URL. So I have a demo for that as well. So as I mentioned, when you first start up the query generator, it just displays a form with one drop-down that allows you to select which CGI you want to send to. So let's go ahead and select the object Json Cgi. And as I said, it goes out and it does a help query. And when that information returns, you can see then what options are available. The query option is required for every query. Kind of makes sense. That's why it's in red. And then there are two additional options here. The format options I mentioned, white space, enumerate, bit mask, duration, and then a date format. So if you want your dates to be human readable, if you don't specify a date format, it comes back in the default JSON date format, which is number of milliseconds since the beginning of the Unix epoch. And if you mouse over most fields, there's a little bit of help that pops up. That's a long one, but. So let's go ahead and scroll down. You see there's also help available on items in the selection list, so you can get a little bit more idea what's going on. Let's do a help query. And you can see there a couple of things. The URL that was actually used to generate these results, the format version. Here's the result information. and then the data down here. I don't remember what I did next in this movie, so I'm going to have to wait for it to happen. Ah, yes, I put in a date format, and it uses the stir-ftime date formats. You can see now these dates are a little bit more human readable. We can take this URL, and I think the next thing we're going to do is open it in another tab to make it a little bit more easy to read. Again, you see the format version, the result information, and the data object. This is the one case where there is no selector because selectors don't make sense on help. But then you can see this object is a list of all of the possible options. The first one being query. It's got a label, which is what we used to display the label on the other page. Its type is enumeration, meaning it can use any one of these valid values here for a value for that option. In this case, query is required for all queries. Makes sense. So it's got that all field in there. And because it is required for all fields, it's really optional for none of them. That's why this optional array is empty. This depends on is used right now only for services. So if you want a particular service, you can specify that. This description is what was used for the help. And then you see all of the options there scrolling by. Second field to take a look at here is the format options. Remember that we had white space, enumerate, bit mask, and duration. Well, that's of type list, which list means that you can choose 0 or more of these as values for this particular option. It's never required, but it's always optional. And then finally, one more option here. Take a look at the start option. What that allows you to do is if it's optional for any of the list queries. So if you want a list of hosts, you can say, well, what starting index do I want for the hosts that this system returns? So if you got a large system, you can break down your host list into sizable chunks. Let's do a simple query here. We're just going to get a list of hosts. You can see the additional selectors here, but we're not selecting any of them. This is my development system, so it's pretty simple. I got 5 hosts in my configuration. And you can see I didn't specify any selectors, so that selector object is empty. The next thing I'm going to do is use one of the selectors. In fact, I'm going to take parent host and select none as the parent host. None meaning that the host is contactable directly by the Nagios server. There's no intervening system. And on my system, you can see it here. It displays that I have a selector host, a parent host, and 4 hosts that are directly reachable. We bring up the next query, which is the host list query. If we run that with no options, you can see it lists the 5 hosts that I have in my development environment. You'll notice too there are 2 additional selectors here, the start and account. As I mentioned earlier, start allows you to specify a starting index, and count is a number of items to return. So if you had a very large environment, let's say 10,000 hosts, you could get 500 at a time or something like that by making repeated queries. This shows you that we started, index 1, and we got 2 hosts. The other option on here that's kind of new for lists is the show details. Normally in the object JSON query, when you ask for a host list, it just returns the name of the host. But if you specify details, it will return the details for each of the hosts. So these are the details for that AIX host, and then the details for localhost. And then we'll do a quick host query. In this case, because we want to specify an individual host, the host name is a required field. So let's set it to localhost and do the query. And there you can see the host was returned. Its name is localhost. And I don't remember whether I was going to do anything else. Kind of scroll down here through it. Show you all the information in there. think actually this is where I was going to demonstrate, yeah, so if you see right now it shows initial state as 0. Well, what does 0 mean? Well, if you turn on enumerate, actually you only would have to turn on enumerate in this case, but if you turn enumerate and or bit mask on, now it says you initial state is up. So it's more human readable if you do that. Yes, it is. So it does support full UTF-8. So that was one of the issues that I was working on when I started working on this. So let's take a look at the status JSON. Again, there are count, list, and individual objects here. A couple of new selectors. The host status, so you can say I only want you to count the number of hosts that are up or down or up and down. The other one is the host time field. So you can pick a particular time field within the host information. Let's say in this case, last hard state change. And you can say -600 means in the last 10 minutes, the last 600 seconds. So you can see that the number of hosts in any that have transitioned to any state is 0 in the last 10 minutes, which is kind of interesting for, I mean, kind of expected for my rather boring setup. Turn on a couple of the format options. Now you can see the selector was, host time field was last hard state change, and there's the start time. Okay, a quick host list, query, the same thing. No, I take that back. We're not going to do any that have changed. The difference between host list in the object JSON and host list in the status JSON is that in the status JSON, host list also includes the current status of the host. And then a quick query of the host shows detailed information about the host. You know, last plugin output, perf data, a whole bunch of timestamps, all of that information about the host. All right, let's run over real quick and take a look at the last CGI, which is the archive CGI. And I think the first thing we're going to do is an alert count. There we go, alert count. Now you notice lots of selector options available here. Start time and end time are both required, and so that large number is 60 days ago, and the end time is right now. So if we go ahead and send the query, because it's parsing log files, it takes a little bit to get the answer back, but there you can see there have been 143 alerts in the last 60 days. Similarly, let's go ahead and do a notification list. And I think we're going to limit it to hosts. Same time period. There you go. That's the list of the notifications that have taken place in the last 60 days for hosts. But I think we may go up and turn on some nice formatting options.
And Eric,
So-
it looks like about 2 minutes left here. While you're showing that, anybody have any questions or comments so far with anything they've gone over?
Just a couple things real quick. I think we're going to do just an availability report here real fast, and then I can grab your question. Turning on duration, we're going to pick a host. We're going to use do only hard notification, or excuse me, only include hard states in the calculation. And we'll go ahead and send the query. Wait a second or two, and there you can see the availability for localhost over the last 60 days. All right, that's all I had. So questions?
Is it possible to query by custom object variable?
At this point, it is not.
But it will show this variable, you know.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I need to implement. I should say real quick that the state of this is that it's currently available in Git on SourceForge. It's in a separate branch, JSON branch. There are some known issues. There are some authorization checks that we still need to make. There's one issue that I know of in terms of parent and child relationships that needs to be worked on. There are some selectors that are not implemented yet, but I'm happy to have feedback from you guys. And I know we're running out of time, so we probably don't have time for questions, but someone has suggested that maybe if there's enough interest, we could do a birds of a feather session over lunch tomorrow, assuming we can get the room. Is there anybody that would be interested in doing that? Okay, one hand? All right, well, two hands, okay. Well, we'll see what we can do in terms of getting a room, so watch the room schedules to see whether or not that is going to work out. So.
Excellent. Let's hear it for Eric and Andy.